was to affirm that there really are three persons in a rich psychological sense who are the one God. In sum, while modalism affirmed the equal deity of the three persons at the expense of their personal distinctness, Orthodox Christianity maintained both the equal deity and personal distinctness of the three persons. Moreover, they did so while claiming to maintain the commitment of all parties to monotheism. There exists only one God who is somehow three persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. So now we come to 2.4, models of the Trinity. Does the doctrine of the Trinity make sense? Enlightenment thinkers denounce the doctrine as an incoherence. But during the 20th century, many theologians came to a reappreciation of Trinitarian theology. And in recent decades, a number of Christian philosophers have sought to formulate defensible versions of the doctrine of the Trinity. Two broad models or approaches are typically identified. Social Trinitarianism, which lays greater emphasis on the diversity of the persons, and Latin Trinitarianism, which places greater stress on the unity of God. This nomenclature is, however, misleading, since the great Latin church fathers, Tertullian and Hilary, were both social Trinitarians, as was Athanasius, a fount of Latin theology. Therefore, we shall instead contrast social Trinitarianism with what one wag has called anti-social Trinitarianism. The central commitment of social Trinitarianism is that in God there are three distinct centers of self-consciousness, each with its proper intellect and will. The central commitment of anti-social Trinitarianism is that there is only one God whose unicity of intellect and will is not compromised by the diversity of persons. Social Trinitarianism threatens to veer into tritheism. Anti-social Trinitarianism is in danger of lapsing into Unitarianism. Let's talk first then a little bit about social Trinitarianism. Social Trinitarians typically look to the Cappadocian Fathers as their champions. As we've seen, they explain the difference between substance and hypostasis as the difference between a generic essence, say man, and particular exemplifications of it. In this case, several men, like Peter, James, and John. This leads to an obvious question. If Peter, James, and John are three men, each having the same nature, then why would not the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit similarly be three gods, each exemplifying the divine nature? In his letter to Ablabius on not three gods, Gregory of Nyssa struggled to answer this question. He recognizes the primacy of the universal, which is one and unchangeable in each of the three men. It's kind of Platonism here. The universal is the real reality, the primary reality. This is merely to highlight a universal property, which Gregory holds to be one in its many exemplifications, rather than the property instance of that universal in each man. Gregory, like Plato, thinks of the universal as the primary reality. He advises that rather than speak of three gods, we ought instead to speak of one man. But this answer solves nothing. Even if we think of the universal as the primary reality, it is still undeniable that there are three exemplifications of that reality, or three instances of it at least, who in the one case are three distinct men, as is obvious from the fact that one man can cease to exist without the others ceasing to do so. Similarly, even if the one divine nature is the primary reality, still it is undeniably exemplified or instantiated by three hypostases, each of which should be an instance of deity. In order to block the inference to three gods, Gregory also appeals to the ineffability of the divine nature and to the fact that all the operations of the Trinity toward the world involve the participation of all three persons. But even granted his assumptions, one cannot justifiably conclude that there are not three cooperatively acting individuals who each exemplify this ineffable nature. and any remaining indistinguishability seems to be purely epistemic, not ontological. Gregory goes on to stress that every operation between God and creation finds its origin in the Father, proceeds through the Son, and is perfected by the Holy Spirit. Because of this, he claims, we cannot speak of those who conjointly and inseparably carry out these operations as three gods. But Gregory's inference seems unjustified. Simply because we creatures cannot distinguish the persons who carry out such operations, one cannot therefore conclude that there are not three instances of the divine nature at work. Moreover, the very fact that these operations originate in the Father, proceed through the Son, and are perfected by the Spirit seems to prove that there are three distinct, if inseparable, operations in every work of the Trinity toward creation. Finally, Gregory appears to deny that the divine nature can be multiply exemplified. He identifies the principle of individuation as bodily appearance and size and place and difference in figure and color. That which is not thus circumscribed is not enumerated, and that which is not enumerated cannot be contemplated in multitude. Therefore, he says, the divine nature does not admit, in its own case, the signification of multitude. But if this is Gregory's argument, not only is it incompatible with there being three gods, but it precludes there being even one God. The divine nature would be unexemplifiable since there is no principle to individuate it. If it cannot be enumerated, it cannot even be one. On the other hand, if Gregory's argument intends merely to show that there is just one generic divine nature, not many, then he has simply proved too little. For the universal nature may be one, but multiply exemplifiable. Given that there are three hypostases in the Godhead, distinguished according to Gregory by the intra-trinitarian relations, then there should be three gods. The most pressing task of contemporary social Trinitarians is to find some more convincing answer to why, on their view, there are not three gods. So let's say something about antisocial Trinitarianism. Antisocial Trinitarians typically look to Latin-speaking theologians like Augustine and Aquinas as their champions. To a considerable extent, the appeal to Augustine rests on a misinterpretation, which results in taking in isolation his analogies of the Trinity in the human mind, such as the lover, the beloved, and love itself, or memory, understanding, and will. So I'm going to skip over Augustine, and let's go to page 17 to Thomas Aquinas. For a bona fide example of antisocial Trinitarianism, we may turn to Thomas Aquinas, who pushes the Augustinian analogy to its apparent limit. Aquinas holds that there is a likeness of the Trinity in the human mind insofar as it understands itself and loves itself. We find in the mind itself, the mind conceived in the intellect, and the mind beloved in the will. The difference between this human likeness and the Trinity is, first, that the human mind's acts of understanding and will are not identical with its being. And second, that the mind as understood and the mind as beloved do not subsist, and so are not persons. By contrast, Aquinas' doctrine of divine simplicity implies that God's acts of understanding and willing are identical with his being. And he holds further, paradoxically, that God as understood and God as beloved do subsist and therefore count as distinct persons from the Father. According to Aquinas, since God knows himself, there is in God the one who knows and the intentional object of that knowledge, which is the one known. The one known exists in the one knowing as his word. They share the same essence and are indeed identical to it, but they are relationally distinct. Indeed, Aquinas holds that the different divine persons just are the different relations in God, like paternity, being father of, and filiation, being son of. Despite his commitment to divine simplicity, Aquinas regards these relations